The Duke tried to own what was never his, and paid the price. The rain came down hard on Thornefield Manor the night Desiree Meeks arrived. She stood in the courtyard, soaked, still, deliberately small, and watched Duke Alastair laugh. He was standing beneath the warm glow of the entrance lanterns with two of his associates, crystal glass in hand, gesturing lazily in her direction the way a man gestures at something he has already decided is beneath him. "Doesn't understand a syllable," he said, loud enough that the words carried across the wet stone. "Came all this way from her father's little empire and can't speak the king's English to save her life. Beautiful girl, I'll grant her that." He swirled his drink. But empty. Absolutely empty upstairs. His men laughed. Desiree blinked. Let her lips part softly. Tilted her head with the gentle, harmless confusion of someone hearing sounds they cannot decode. She had perfected that expression over years of practice in front of a mirror. Inside, she was recording him. The Duke of Thornefield believed he had acquired a silent doll, a foreign-born ward with a pretty face and a blank mind, a girl who sat in corners and caused no trouble and understood nothing of the world being conducted around her. He believed this because he needed to believe it. Because if she understood him, if she had always understood him, then every word he had spoken freely in her presence for 3 years was not a private thought. It was evidence. And there was so much of it. She had heard him name the judges he owned. She had heard him describe, with casual pride, how he had forged the final amendments to her father's will. She had heard him pour a glass of brandy and tell his solicitor, laughing, that Arthur Meeks had not simply fallen from his horse. That the fall had been arranged. That the only loose end remaining was the daughter, and that the daughter, thankfully, was too foreign and too foolish to be any kind of threat. He had said all of this in front of her. She had not missed a word. Tonight, Alastair was throwing the grandest gala of his career, an engagement celebration, an announcement of his total, permanent acquisition of the Meeks shipping line. The most powerful people in the country were already filling his ballroom. He would place a pen in Desiree's hand before all of them, and she would sign, and it would be finished. 3 years of patience. 3 years of silence. 3 years of building a case so airtight that when the moment finally came, there would be no escaping it. Not for him, not for his mistress, not for a single corrupt judge whose name she had memorized in the dark. The Duke thought tonight was his victory. He had no idea it was her stage. To understand the woman Desiree became, you need to understand the world she was born into, and the precise moment that world was stolen from her. Arthur Meeks was not a man who inherited his greatness. He built it, plank by plank and contract by contract, beginning with 3 modest fishing vessels and a reputation for delivering cargo on time and undamaged in an industry where neither was guaranteed. By the time Desiree was born, the Meeks shipping line was the most respected independent fleet on the coast. Not the largest, not the most aristocratic, but the most trusted. Men who had been burned by noble-born merchants with pretty promises came to Arthur Meeks because his word was his bond, and his bond was worth more than any wax seal stamped with a family crest. He was, in a world that prized birth above almost everything else, proof that it was possible to build something real from nothing. And he was determined that his daughter would inherit every inch of it. Desiree did not grow up in drawing rooms learning to be decorative. She grew up on the docks, standing beside her father as he negotiated contracts, reading ledgers at an age when most girls at station were learning embroidery. Arthur Meeks taught her to read a balance sheet the way other fathers taught their sons to ride. He took her aboard the ships. He introduced her to his captains as the future of this company. He sent her abroad for her education, 3 countries over 4 years, because he believed that a woman who could move through the world fluently, who could think and speak and negotiate in multiple tongues, would be untouchable. She came home at 17 speaking 4 languages. She came home to find her father dead. The official account was a riding accident. Clean. Tragic. Unverifiable. The kind of death that raises eyebrows but not investigations, particularly when the deceased is a self-made merchant with no noble connections and the eyebrows in question belong to magistrates who have recently had their considerable debts quietly settled by a third party. There was no inquiry worth the name. There was no thorough examination of the will, despite amendments made in the final days of Arthur's life in handwriting that did not sit quite right. There was only a burial, a forged document, and Duke Alastair of Thornefield, materializing at the graveside with a letter of guardianship, a hand pressed to his heart, and a performance of grief so polished it must have taken years to rehearse. He was her protector, he told the assembled mourners. Her father's most trusted friend. He would manage the estate. He would safeguard her inheritance. He would ensure that the Meek's fortune remained exactly where Arthur would have wanted it, waiting, intact, for his beloved daughter. Desiree stood over her father's grave and watched Alistair's eyes drift, not to her face, not to the coffin, but to the harbour below, where the Meek's fleet sat gleaming in the grey afternoon light like a row of prizes already counted. She was 17 years old. She had just buried the only person who had ever truly known her. She had no legal standing, no allies in the city, no proof of anything that had happened, only instinct, sharp as a blade, telling her exactly what Alistair was and exactly what he intended to do. She also knew what she could not afford to be, not yet, visible. Any accusation she made would be crushed instantly. A foreign-born orphan girl, emotional, grieving, without title or male advocate, against a duke with the magistracy in his pocket. She had seen how that particular contest ended for women who fought before they were ready. She had no intention of becoming another cautionary tale. So she did something that required more discipline than any battle ever could. She chose to wait. She went to Thornefield Manor as his ward. She sat at his table and slept under his roof and let his household treat her as an unfortunate charity case, pitied, condescended to, and fundamentally disregarded. She performed helplessness with the dedication of a woman who understood that being underestimated was not a humiliation to be survived. It was a strategy to be weaponized. And at the center of that strategy was a single, devastating deception. So simple that Alistair, for all his cunning, never thought to question it. Desiree Meeks, educated across 3 countries, fluent in 4 languages, trained by the sharpest mercantile mind of his generation, pretended she could not speak English. Not poorly. Not haltingly. Not with the broken, apologetic speech of someone still learning. Completely. Totally. She smiled at the wrong cues. She responded to tone instead of words. She let housemaids slow repeat instructions to her with exaggerated gestures, and she received them with wide, grateful, perfectly blank eyes. And just like that, she became invisible. Invisible in the library when Alistair met with his solicitor. Invisible in the study when he discussed the corrupt judges whose silence he maintained. Invisible in the drawing room when his mistress, Pamela Williams, laughed about the fortune they were bleeding from a dead man's estate. They spoke freely because they believed she could not understand them. Every word they spoke freely was a brick in the case she was building. For 3 years, Desiree Meeks sat in silence and constructed the most meticulous, airtight, devastating act of legal retribution that Thornefield had ever seen. She decoded Alistair's private correspondence using a cipher her father had taught her. She memorized names, dates, account numbers, and locations. She documented the murder of her father, the forgery of his will, the systematic theft of everything he had spent his life creating. And then she waited for the perfect moment, the moment when Alistair was most confident, most surrounded, most certain that he had finally, completely, and irrevocably won. He gave her that moment himself. He called it an engagement gala. She called it a reckoning. This is the story of what Desiree Meeks did with 3 years of silence, 1 room full of powerful witnesses, and a voice that the Duke of Thornefield never once thought to fear. He tried to own what was never his. He paid the price. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The carriage rolled through the iron gates of Thornefield Manor on a Tuesday morning, and Desiree Meeks stepped out of it looking exactly like what Alistair needed her to be, overwhelmed, grateful, and utterly lost. She let her eyes travel slowly across the estate's imposing facade, lips parted, chin tipped upward in the manner of someone encountering a world entirely beyond their comprehension. A footman reached for her single trunk. She startled at his approach, then smiled, that soft, apologetic smile she had rehearsed until it sat on her face as naturally as breathing, and stepped aside to let him work. Alistair was waiting at the top of the entrance stairs. He was taller than she had expected, and better dressed, and wore his charm the way certain men wear expensive cologne, applied heavily, intended to overwhelm. He descended 2 steps and spread his arms in a gesture of magnificent welcome, speaking slowly and with theatrical enunciation, the way people speak to the very old or the very young. Welcome to Thornefield. He pointed at the ground beneath his feet. Your new home. Desiree blinked at him. Then she dipped into a small, uncertain curtsy, eyes wide, expression hovering somewhere between gratitude and confusion. Alistair turned to his steward with a satisfied nod. "Good," he said, his voice dropping back to its natural register, the performance of warmth dissolving the moment he believed she could no longer parse it. "Exactly as I was told. She understands nothing." She understood everything. She understood him most of all 3 days later, when he led her through her father's old study, now stripped of Arthur's maps and ledgers, redecorated in Alistair's preferred shades of dark wood and self-importance, and stood before her with his hands clasped behind his back, watching her face with the particular curiosity of a man conducting an experiment. "Your father," he said conversationally, studying her eyes, "was a foolish man. Clever with ships, perhaps, but foolish in the ways that matter. He tilted his head. He trusted people he shouldn't have. Built something beautiful and then left it completely undefended." A small smile. "Men like that don't deserve what they build." Desiree stood in the center of the room that had once smelled of her father's pipe tobacco and old sea charts. She held her hands loosely at her sides. She let her gaze drift to the window, vaguely, as though she were watching birds. Not a flicker. Not a tremor. Not a single tell. Alistair watched her for a long moment, then exhaled, satisfied, certain, already bored. "Perfect," he murmured to no one in particular, moving toward the door. "Absolutely perfect." He meant it as an assessment of her uselessness. Desiree, still gazing at the window, filed the conversation, word for word, inflection for inflection, into the growing archive she maintained behind those blank and patient eyes. She had been at Thornefield Manor for 3 days. She was already building the case that would destroy him. The embroidery hoop had been Desiree's idea. She had requested it through the housekeeper in the second week, a halting pantomime of needle and thread that sent the woman away nodding with the particular tenderness reserved for the simple-minded. It arrived the following morning, a wooden hoop, ivory thread, a square of cream linen already stamped with a floral pattern requiring no creativity whatsoever. Decorative. Domestic. Harmless. It was the most useful thing in Thornefield Manor. Because a woman bent quietly over embroidery in the corner of a library was not a woman. She was furniture. And furniture, Alistair had apparently decided, did not require privacy. The meetings began in the 3rd week. They came in the early evenings, 2, sometimes 3 men arriving through the side entrance, coats damp, voices low until they crossed the library threshold and found Desiree in her usual chair by the window, needle moving in slow, bovine loops through the linen. Alistair would glance at her, register nothing of consequence, and turn his back. The first name she collected was Hargrove. Judge Hargrove of the Eastern Circuit, who had presided over the inquest into her father's death and returned a verdict of accidental misadventure in under an hour. Alistair mentioned him the way men mention reliable machinery, without sentiment, with complete confidence in its continued function. "Hargrove will hold," he told his solicitor. "He's owed me since the Bellamy case and he knows it." Desiree pulled her thread through the linen. In, out. In, out. The second name was Pemberton. A magistrate. His debt to Alistair was financial rather than legal, a sum advanced 3 years ago at a moment of particular desperation, never repaid, never meant to be. Debt, Alistair understood perfectly, was more reliable than loyalty. She kept her eyes on the embroidery. It was in the 4th week that she learned about the deeds. Alistair's solicitor, a thin, anxious man named Crow who sweated visibly whenever documents were discussed, raised the matter in a lowered voice that Desiree's trained ear caught without effort. The original deeds to the Meeks vessels, it seemed, had not been destroyed after the forgery. Crow had advised destroying them. Alistair had overruled him. "I keep things," Alistair said simply. "One never knows." "And their location?" Crow pressed. A pause. The sound of a drawer being referenced, or perhaps gestured toward. Behind the Thornton portrait. East corridor, 3rd floor. Where nothing inconvenient ever gets found. Crow murmured something about risk. Alistair murmured something about Crow's continued employment. The meeting ended shortly after. Desiree finished the outermost petal of a cream rose she had been slowly, methodically stitching for 11 days. She examined it with the mild, unfocused satisfaction of someone with nowhere particular to be and nothing particular to think about. Then she folded the linen neatly in her lap. Behind the Thornton portrait. East corridor. 3rd floor. She would need perhaps 20 minutes. Pamela Williams arrived on a Friday, which Desiree would later think was fitting. Fridays had always struck her as the day of the week most suited to inconveniences. She came with 4 trunks, a lady's maid who looked permanently braced for impact, and the particular energy of a woman who had fought hard for a position she would never quite feel secure in. Title, as both armor and advantage. She assessed Desiree within 30 seconds of their introduction. Whatever she saw apparently satisfied her, because her shoulders dropped half an inch and she smiled, not warmly, but with the specific relief of a woman who has just confirmed that a potential rival is, in fact, no rival at all. "Oh, the little ward," she said to Alistair, in the tone one reserves for stray animals taken in out of obligation. How terribly sad for her. It became Pamela's primary entertainment within a fortnight. She would summon Desiree to the sitting room each afternoon under the guise of language instruction, a performance of charity she seemed to genuinely enjoy, positioning herself as benefactress to an unfortunate foreign girl. She would sit upright in the window chair, Desiree arranged obediently on the footstool before her like a child awaiting a lesson, and she would point at objects around the room and provide their names. Except she didn't. "That," Pamela would say, pointing at the fireplace, "is called stupid girl." She would wait for Desiree to repeat it. Desiree would repeat it carefully, with the earnest mispronunciation of a diligent student. Pamela would dissolve into laughter. Her lady's maid, hovering by the door, would produce a thin, uncomfortable smile. She called the window worthless. She called the teacup pathetic little orphan. She pointed at Desiree's reflection in the mirror one afternoon and said, with the cheerful cruelty of someone who had never once been held accountable for it, "That is what a fool looks like." Desiree looked at her own reflection, nodded seriously, mouthed the words back. She memorized all of it. Not because the insults wounded her, she had insulated herself against Pamela Williams the moment she had taken the woman's measure, but because cruelty, she had learned, was its own form of confession. Every casual degradation Pamela performed revealed the precise shape of her insecurity. Every laugh at Desiree's expense was a measurement of how threatened she felt by a girl she believed to be defenseless. Pamela Williams was threatened by her. That was information. Desiree sat on the footstool afternoon after afternoon, repeating false words with dutiful sincerity, and behind her wide and guileless eyes she catalogued each insult with the cold, methodical precision of a woman keeping score. She was keeping score. Every single one. Thornefield Manor slept deeply. This was the first thing Desiree had mapped about the household, its rhythms, its silences, the exact progression of sounds that marked the estate's descent from wakefulness into unconsciousness. The last kitchen maid retired at 10:30. The night footman made his rounds at 11 and again at 2, taking the east corridor first, then the west, his boots producing a distinctive uneven cadence from an old ankle injury that announced him a full 30 seconds before he arrived. Alistair's chamberlight extinguished reliably at midnight. Pamela's, some nights, burned until 1. By 1:30, the manor was a tomb. Desiree would rise at 1:15, moving through the dark in stocking feet with the unhurried confidence of someone who had long since memorized every creak in every floorboard between her room and the study. She carried no candle on the corridor. She lit one only when the door was closed behind her and the curtains drawn, a single flame, carefully positioned, throwing just enough light across the desk without reaching the gap beneath the door. Her father's cipher lived in the lining of her traveling trunk, stitched into the fabric with the same ivory thread she used for her embroidery. Arthur Meeks had taught it to her at 13, framing it as a game, a private language between the two of them, used for years in nothing more consequential than playful notes slipped under breakfast plates. She doubted he had ever imagined she would need it for this. She imagined he would have been proud regardless. Alistair's private correspondence was not difficult to access. He was a man of enormous confidence and therefore ordinary caution. He locked his desk, but the lock was a simple lever mechanism that yielded without complaint to a narrow letter opener applied with patience. She had been inside his desk within the first month. She had never disturbed a single thing. The letters, in isolation, were careful. Alistair was not a foolish man. Names were abbreviated, figures were vague, transactions were described in the bureaucratic language of legitimate commerce. To a casual reader, they were boring. To someone with her father's cipher and 3 months of contextual knowledge built from library corners and embroidery hoops, they were a confession. It was on a Wednesday night in the 6th month that she found Pamela. Not her name, Alistair was too careful for that. But the hand was unmistakable, a looping, slightly rightward slant she had studied across dozens of afternoon insults, and the content made the identity irrefutable. A series of transfers. Figures moved in careful increments, small enough to avoid scrutiny, frequent enough to accumulate into something staggering. Through a bank in Calais and then onward into an account registered to a name Desiree didn't recognize. She decoded the full sequence twice to be certain. Pamela Williams was not merely Alastair's mistress. She was his partner. The embezzlement operation was methodical, unhurried, and had been running for longer than Desiree had been at Thornefield. She sat back from the desk. The candle threw its quiet light across the page, across her father's cipher, across numbers that represented money extracted from an empire built by a man whose death had been called an accident. She blew the candle out and sat for a moment in the complete dark. Then she picked up her pen and began to write it all down. Julian Blackwood arrived on a grey Thursday morning with the quiet, unhurried manner of a man who noticed everything and announced nothing. Desiree marked him immediately as different. Most men who came to Thornefield announced themselves through noise. Loud greetings, confident footsteps, the particular bluster of people accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around their arrival. Blackwood did none of this. He was perhaps 35, plainly dressed for a king's investigator, and he had the still, observant quality of someone who understood that silence was a more effective information-gathering tool than any question. He shook Alastair's hand and smiled at the appropriate moments and said very little, and Desiree, watching from the periphery in her customary posture of gentle vacancy, recognized in him something she recognized in very few people. He was also watching. Alastair, predictably, read none of this. He saw a representative of the King's office requiring the standard performance of cooperative nobility and launched into it with enthusiasm. The tour of the estate, the rehearsed anecdotes, the carefully curated portrait of a man with nothing whatsoever to conceal. He was at his most expansive, most charming, most utterly convinced of his own imperviousness. It was the perfect conditions for what Desiree needed to do. Tea was served in the east sitting room at 11:30. Desiree was present in her habitual capacity. Ornamental, peripheral, ignored. She sat near the low table where the housekeeper had arranged the service, hands folded in her lap, gaze drifting pleasantly toward the window. On the table beside the tea tray, Alastair had left a folder of documents, land transfer records, she knew, relating to 3 of her father's coastal warehouses, recently and fraudulently absorbed into the Thornefield estate. She had been waiting for a document like that to appear in an accessible location for 2 months. She reached for the teapot at the precise moment Alastair turned to gesture grandly toward the window, describing some improvement he had made to the grounds. Her hand caught the edge of her cup. The cup caught the edge of the saucer. The saucer tipped, and a generous arc of hot tea descended directly onto the folder with a decisiveness that could not have been more accurate had she aimed it. The room erupted into the minor chaos of spilled tea, Alastair's exclamation, the housekeeper materializing from nowhere with linen, Desiree producing her most mortified and bewildered expression, hands fluttering helplessly. Blackwood was closest. He moved to the table instinctively, lifting documents clear of the spreading liquid, and Desiree moved with him, dabbing uselessly with her handkerchief, and in the 3 seconds in which their hands occupied the same space and every eye in the room was focused on the damage rather than its cause, she pressed a folded note into his palm with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed the movement until it required no thought at all. She felt his fingers close around it without hesitation. She stepped back, resumed her expression of distressed apology, and let the housekeeper take over the cleaning. Across the room, Alastair was already recovering his composure, already redirecting the conversation back to himself. Blackwood straightened. He did not look at her. He did not look at his closed fist. He simply smoothed his jacket with his free hand and returned his attention to Alastair with the expression of a man who had just witnessed nothing more remarkable than a clumsy girl spilling tea. But as he turned, Desiree caught the precise moment his thumb moved, pressing once against the folded paper in his palm, confirming its existence, acknowledging its receipt. He had understood immediately that it was not an accident. Later, she knew, he would unfold it. He would read 7 words written in the flawless, educated hand of a woman who supposedly could not string a sentence together in this language. The wolf is in the library. Look behind the portrait of the hunt. She returned to her chair by the window, folded her hands, resumed her expression of pleasant, empty calm. For the first time in 8 months, she was not entirely alone in this. The proposal, if it could be called that, came on a Sunday. Desiree had sensed it building for weeks. There had been a shift in the way Alastair looked at her recently, a new quality of calculation beneath the habitual indifference. Where once he had regarded her as settled, resolved, a problem already solved, he had begun to regard her as a variable. She had noticed him consulting with Crow more frequently. She had noticed documents emerging from the locked lower drawer of his desk, the drawer she had not yet successfully opened, and being studied with the focused attention of a man revising a plan. She had said nothing. She had simply waited. It was Pamela who came to her room. She arrived without knocking, which told Desiree everything about the register of the conversation before a single word was spoken. Pamela in charitable performance always knocked. It was part of the theatre of benevolence she maintained for the household's benefit. Pamela without an audience was a considerably less polished production. She closed the door behind her and stood in the center of the room and looked at Desiree with an expression that had finally, entirely dropped the pretense of warmth. What remained underneath was something colder and more honest than anything Pamela had shown her in months of afternoon cruelties. She held up a document. Thick paper, formal script, a signature line at the bottom. "You are going to sign this," she said, slowly and clearly, in the manner she always used, the manner of someone addressing a person of limited comprehension. Only this time the slowness was not for comedy. It was for emphasis. "The Duke wishes to marry you. It is a very good arrangement. You will sign." She set the contract on the small writing table near the window. Then she crossed her arms and her expression completed its transformation into something that had no warmth left in it at all. "Your father," Pamela said, her voice dropping to a register she clearly reserved for conversations she intended to leave no record of, "had an accident. A very unfortunate, very final accident." She let that sit in the air between them for a moment. The Duke is a careful man. He plans carefully. He solves problems carefully. Her eyes moved to Desiree's with a directness that was almost its own form of violence. "You are very close to becoming a problem." The room was completely silent. Desiree sat with her hands in her lap and let her lower lip tremble, just slightly, just enough. She let her eyes fill with the particular sheen of someone processing a threat too large for their comprehension. She looked at the contract. She looked at Pamela. She looked at the contract again. Then she nodded. Small, frightened, defeated. Pamela's shoulders released. She smoothed her skirt with the satisfied composure of a woman who had just completed an unpleasant task efficiently. "Good girl," she said, and left without closing the door behind her. Desiree sat motionless until the footsteps faded completely down the corridor. Then she looked at the contract on the table, the document Alistair believed would seal her silence permanently, legally, irrevocably, and something moved across her face that Pamela, had she stayed one moment longer, would not have been able to interpret as fear. It was not fear. It was the quiet, focused satisfaction of a woman watching the final piece move exactly into position. She had what she needed. The threat against her father's life, spoken plainly and witnessed by no one Pamela could call upon. A confession delivered in the privacy of a room Pamela believed contained no one capable of understanding it. Desiree reached for her pen. Not to sign. To write. She had a letter to finish, one addressed to Julian Blackwood, care of the King's office, marked urgent, and already 3/4 complete. The ballroom had never looked more magnificent, which Desiree thought was appropriate. Alistair had spared nothing. The chandeliers had been restrung with fresh crystal that threw fractured light across every surface. The flowers alone must have cost more than a month of her father's crew wages, cascading arrangements of white roses and hothouse lilies banking every column, every doorway, every surface that might otherwise remind a guest that this room had been decorated by someone else's taste. The orchestra was the finest available. The champagne was French. The guest list read like a complete inventory of every powerful person in the country whom Alistair either needed to impress or needed to witness what was about to happen. He had built himself a stage. Desiree had spent considerable time ensuring it would serve a different production than the one he had rehearsed. She descended the entrance stairs at 8 o'clock in a gown of deep ivory that had been selected for her by Pamela, a deliberate choice, she understood, designed to make her look bridal, compliant, already absorbed. She wore her hair simply. She kept her eyes soft and slightly unfocused, that familiar expression of mild bewilderment she had maintained across 2 years and 8 months of living in this house. Around her, the ballroom murmured and glittered and moved with the specific energy of an audience that had come to witness a coronation. She found Julian Blackwood within 4 minutes. He was standing near the east column with a glass he had not touched, dressed well enough to belong and plainly enough to be overlooked. Their eyes met for precisely 1 second. He gave nothing away. Neither did she. It was enough. Pamela arrived on Alistair's arm shortly after, and the room's attention shifted toward them with the gravitational pull of choreographed entrance. She was dressed in midnight blue, and at her throat and ears and wrists, catching the chandelier light, demanding to be seen, were diamonds that Desiree recognized with a recognition that lived below thought, below language, somewhere in the body's oldest memory. Her mother's diamonds. The Meek stones, worn by Eleanor Meeks at every significant occasion of her adult life, kept in a velvet case in her father's safe for the 20 years since her mother's passing, waiting, Arthur had always said, for Desiree's wedding day. Pamela touched them once, lightly, with the proprietary confidence of someone who has already decided that possession is the only title that matters. Desiree looked at them for exactly as long as it took to confirm what she was seeing. Then she looked away. The announcement came at 9:30. Alistair positioned himself at the ballroom center with the practiced ease of a man who had been performing authority his entire life, and he spoke of legacy and union and the proud future of the Meek shipping line. Now, he was pleased to confirm, formally and permanently incorporated into the Thornefield estate. The room applauded. He turned to Desiree with the warm, magnanimous smile of a man distributing a gift, and extended the pen. She took it with slightly trembling fingers. She looked down at the contract on the table before her, her name on the signature line, her inheritance on the page, her father's life's work reduced to a document requiring only this one final cooperative gesture from a girl everyone in this room believed incapable of anything else. The orchestra had stilled. The room had quieted. Every eye had found her. She held the pen above the paper. And she paused. The pen did not touch the paper. At the last moment, the precise moment the room exhaled in collective anticipation, the precise moment Alistair's smile settled into triumph, Desiree set the pen down. Quietly, deliberately, with the unhurried composure of someone who has been waiting a very long time to do exactly this. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Long enough for confusion to register on Alistair's face. Long enough for Pamela, standing to his left, to tilt her head in the manner of someone who has heard an unfamiliar sound and cannot yet identify its source. Then Desiree straightened, turned to face the room, and spoke. "Your honors, my lords, ladies and gentlemen." Her voice carried without effort, clear and unhurried and melodic, the voice of a woman educated across 3 countries who had spent nearly 3 years feeding it nothing but silence, and whose silence had therefore accumulated into something extraordinary. The words fell across the ballroom like stones dropped into still water, and the ripples moved visibly across every face in the room. Perfect, flawless, unaccented English. She watched the comprehension arrive in Alistair's eyes. Watched it move through him like cold water. Watched him open his mouth and find, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, that nothing came out. "I have been a resident of Thornefield Manor for 2 years and 9 months, she continued, her gaze moving across the assembled crowd with calm precision. "In that time, I have been considered, by my guardian, by his associates, by every person in this house, entirely unable to understand the language spoken around me." A brief pause. "I would like to correct that misapprehension." She turned to face Alistair directly. "On the 14th evening of my 3rd week at Thornefield, you told your solicitor that Judge Hargrove would hold his position because, and I quote your precise words, he's owed me since the Bellamy case and he knows it." She watched the color leave his face. "You described Magistrate Pemberton's debt to you as more reliable than loyalty. You discussed the forged amendments to my father's will in the library while I sat in the corner doing embroidery." Her voice did not waver. It did not rise. It simply continued, each sentence arriving with the quiet devastation of evidence read into an official record. "And you told your solicitor, on a Tuesday evening in November, that my father's death had been necessary." The ballroom was absolutely silent. She turned to Pamela. Pamela, who had gone the color of old ash, whose hand had risen involuntarily to the diamonds at her throat, her mother's diamonds, as though they might anchor her to something solid. "And you," Desiree said, with a quietness that was somehow more devastating than any raised voice, "have been systematically transferring funds from the Meeks estate through a bank in Calais since the month my father died. The account number, the transfer dates, and the name under which the offshore account is registered are already in the possession of the King's Investigative Office." She held Pamela's gaze. "As of this morning." Pamela's hand dropped from the diamonds. Across the room, Julian Blackwood set down his untouched glass and moved toward the doors, where 3 members of the Kingsguard had been waiting, quietly, since 7:30. Desiree looked at the room, at the judges, the magistrates, the lords and ladies who had come to witness a coronation. and she let the silence do what silence, wielded correctly, has always done. She let it speak. They took Alistair first. He did not go quietly, which surprised no one who had observed him carefully and surprised everyone who had only observed him socially. The composure he had worn for decades, that magnificent, impenetrable architecture of ducal authority, collapsed with a speed that was almost instructive. He argued. He threatened. He invoked names, titles, debts owed, and favors outstanding, cycling through every instrument of power he had spent a lifetime assembling, and found that each one had already been rendered inoperative by a girl he had dismissed as furniture. Julian Blackwood watched the arrest with the expression of a man completing a piece of work he had begun some time ago and was satisfied to see finished. He said nothing unnecessary. He had that quality, Desiree had noted, of never spending words he didn't need to. Pamela went more quietly, which was its own kind of revelation. When the moment came, when the guard reached her and the mathematics of her situation became undeniable, something in her simply extinguished. She removed the diamonds from her throat with steady hands and set them on the table nearest to her without being asked. Whether this was conscience or calculation, Desiree neither knew nor particularly needed to. She watched them go. She stood at the head of the ballroom in her ivory gown and she watched the doors close behind them, and she felt the room recalibrate around her, felt the assembled power of the country shifting its collective attention, reassessing, rearranging its understanding of what had just occurred and who, precisely, had orchestrated it. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had preceded it. It was not the silence of a room waiting for something to happen. It was the silence of a room that understood something already had. Crow, she noted, had positioned himself near the servants' exit at some point during the preceding minutes. She made a mental note to ensure Julian received his name before the evening was out. Crow's continued employment prospects were not her immediate concern, but his testimony would be useful, and useful men were best collected before they had time to consult their instincts for self-preservation. She would learn, in the weeks that followed, that her father's ships were recoverable, that the forged will could be challenged and overturned, that the original deeds, retrieved from behind the portrait of the hunt exactly where Alistair had described them, were intact and legally sufficient, that the Meeks shipping line, stripped and mismanaged as it had been, still had its bones, its roots, its reputation, its captains, several of whom had maintained a quiet and stubborn loyalty to the Meeks name across 3 years of uncertain ownership. She would rebuild it. She already knew how. Her father had taught her. But that was for the weeks ahead. Tonight, she stood in the ballroom her enemy had decorated for his own coronation, and she looked out at the assembled faces, astonished, recalculating, unable to look away, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 2 years and 9 months, to be entirely seen. She thought of her father, of his ships in the harbor, of a velvet case of diamonds that had come home. She thought of every evening in that study, every insult absorbed and catalogued, every midnight hour bent over her father's cipher by candlelight, every blank stare she had manufactured and every word she had swallowed and every moment she had chosen patience over the satisfaction of being understood. It had all been in service of this. One of the lords near the front, a man whose name appeared 3 times in her documentation as a witness to fraudulent proceedings, cleared his throat and began to speak. Whether he intended apology or justification, she would never know. She turned her gaze to him with a quietness that stopped the words before they formed. Then she looked back at the room. "I never said I couldn't speak," she said. Her voice was the same unhurried, melodic instrument it had been all evening, calm as a verdict, clear as a bell. "I just said I had nothing to say to you." She set the unsigned contract on the table beside the pen. And she walked out of the ballroom, through the doors that the King's Guard held open, and into a future that had always, from the very beginning, belonged to her. The screen fades slowly on the empty ballroom, the unsigned contract still on the table, the diamonds gone, the chandeliers still burning for a celebration that never happened. Then a cut to black. And a voice, warm, direct, unhurried. Desiree Meeks didn't survive by being louder than the room. She survived by being smarter than everyone in it. 3 years of silence, 1 night of truth, and an empire reclaimed without a single weapon drawn. If this story had you from the first sentence, you already know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Because if you loved Desiree, trust me, the next story is already waiting. And she is just as patient, just as brilliant, and just as done being underestimated. A beat. The doll always had a voice. She was just choosing her moment. Subscribe, like, bell on. See you in the next one.